Well, good morning. Just to confirm, unfortunately, Mark Godsey, as I said at the weekend there, is not able to join me this afternoon at 3 o'clock. He was hoping to do the next day, Thursday, tomorrow, but that also fell through. So I've just said, get back to me as soon as you can, and hopefully we'll get you on as soon as possible, because I really want to speak to Mark Godsey about his book Blind Injustice, because it makes so many references to Making a Murderer, using examples from Making a Murderer to make certain points about the way the system works, or doesn't, I suppose we would say. But obviously, with Saturday's live chat with Tracy Keogh in mind, I do really want to get I really do want to get through this last bit of Mark Godsey's review of police interrogation and American justice, and then looking at the interview of Brendan at Mishicot High School, looking at how Bert and Ernie used the techniques of coercion on Brendan. So where did we get to? Let's just do the last paragraph. These tendencies may be reinforced by an occupational culture that teaches police to be suspicious generally and does not reward them for admitting mistakes or expressing doubts in their judgment. You very rarely get police apologizing, do you? Steve is still waiting for an apology for the 85 wrongful conviction. Anyway, false confessions also occur because in cases in which little evidence of guilt exists, the detectives are convinced in their gut that the suspect is guilty, so they become hell-bent on obtaining a confession. In cases where ample evidence of guilt exists, on the other hand, police may not need a confession or may decide to refrain from interrogation altogether. As a result, extreme psychological interrogation occurs most often when police have relied on little more than their own hunch or intuition to determine guilt. And, as Richard Leo has demonstrated, these intuitions and gut feelings are often wrong. Thus, extreme psychological interrogations do their work most often in cases where strong evidence of guilt is lacking, and thus in cases where suspects are most likely to be innocent. A confession is usually seen by actors in the criminal justice system, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and jurors, as one of the most powerful indicators of guilt. As a result, when a false confession exists, it is often admitted into evidence at trial, and the defendant is convicted as a result of his confession. Studies show that once a suspect falsely confesses, he possibly has more than an 80% chance of being wrongfully convicted. The necessary reforms, policy directives for the future. Richard's suggested reforms, not surprisingly, revolve around the necessity of reducing false confessions at the outset. He rejects the idea of abolishing police interrogation. He believes that interrogation, properly done, is both a necessary and valuable tool to solve many crimes. He further dispenses with the suggestion of others that the interrogation function be performed by prosecutors, magistrates, or judges. Leo contends that prosecutors and judges should remain unburdened by the interrogation process to ensure that they do not become tainted by the inquisitor's role. The reforms Leo urges come in two forms, legal and practical. Leo first suggests reinvigorating the reliability rationale of the due process voluntariness test. Reliability played an important role in determining the admissibility of confessions for much of American jurisprudential history until the Supreme Court undermined that policy rationale in Colorado versus Connolly. I have previously echoed these same concerns, noting that Connolly was ironically decided shortly before the DNA revolution commenced, which cleanly laid bare the problems with false confessions and the dire need for a reliability focus in determining confession admissibility. Leo's primary legal focus is on the creation of a new reliability test. A judge should not admit a confession into evidence, Leo argues, unless he or she has weighed three factors and determined the confession is trustworthy. These factors are, and I'm just wondering, listening to Kathleen Zellner talking about David Hamilton in his dissenting opinion, we are not here to look at scholarly best practices. One wonders, I'm pretty sure these are the kind of best practices that Steve Drizzt and Laura Nyrider would like to see. One, whether the confession contains non-public information that can be independently verified, would be known only by the true perpetrator or an accomplice, and cannot likely be guessed by chance, whether the confession led the police to new evidence about the crime, and three, whether the suspect's post-admission narrative fits the crime facts and other objective evidence. This totality of the circumstances analysis should be performed after the court has determined that the confession is voluntary. The prosecution would have the burden of establishing trustworthiness by a preponderance of the evidence. Of course, for this sort of analysis to work properly, all interrogations would have to be videotaped from beginning to end. Judges would need an objective record by which to analyze and weigh these three prongs. As discussed later, Richard believes that taping should be a universal requirement. And of course, in Wisconsin, it was the Avery Task Force that led to that need for videotaping, Brendan. The legal basis for such a reliability test can be found in Federal Rule of Evidence 403. So he's not suggesting creating new rules. Although an unreliable confession may still be minimally relevant under this rule, it is not particularly probative of a suspect's guilt. And because confession evidence weighs so heavily in the minds of jurors, an unreliable confession is unfairly prejudicial to the defendant and devastating to the innocent. Leo contends that this sort of screening of trustworthiness grounds is not new or novel. It routinely occurs with respect to other types of evidence, including most out-of-court hearsay statements. Leo's primary practical reform goes hand in hand with the new reliability test, a requirement of universal videotaping of interrogations from beginning to end. He notes that this reform has picked up momentum in recent years, with several states now requiring taping either by statute or court decree. Similar legislation is pending in several states across the country, including my home state of Ohio. Remember, Mark Godsey is a former prosecutor of Ken Kratz type proportions, who then set up the Ohio Innocence Project. Part of the reason why we're so keen to speak to him, because his book Blind Injustice really does spell out how you end up with Ken Kratz type prosecutors. Leo believes, and I agree, that a broad requirement for videotaping interrogations is the single most important reform. The benefits of this reform are legion. First and foremost, videotaping creates a clean, objective, and comprehensive record of an interrogation, the equivalent of instant replay. This would prevent false confessions from leading to wrongful convictions in three ways. First, after the play scrutiny of police conduct would help professionalize police departments. Well, despite the fact that Jerome Fox decided to allow the taped confessions to come in, that's certainly one thing that's happening. Bert and Ernie's interrogation is being shown the world over to show how not to interview. Anyway, it would ensure that police play within the bounds of permissible interrogation techniques. Again, it's so obvious that they destroyed those boundaries of what is permissible with a 16-year-old Brendan Dassey. And again, Judge Fox still allowed it in. Second, it would allow experts to analyse the tape before trial. This opportunity is crucial because expert witnesses could look for earmarks of reliability or falsity, such as whether the police fed the suspects facts to adopt. Brendan's ticks every box, doesn't it? Or whether the suspect truly came up with non-public facts on his own. Third, videotaping would provide judges with an objective record to make the three-pronged inquiry in Leo's new reliability test. Taping protects the police by preventing suspects from making false claims that they were abused in the interrogation room or that the police officer failed to recite Miranda warnings. It removes secrecy from this important part of our adversarial process and eliminates the gap in our knowledge that the Supreme Court complained of more than 4 decades ago in the Miranda decision. Law enforcement agencies benefit because a tape recording of a reliable confession is rock-solid evidence at trial. Although you can't help thinking if somebody's given a rock-solid confession, they would probably be better taking the plea bargain. Anyway, recording also saves time and money, drastically cutting down on the time police, prosecutors, judges, and juries must litigate disputes regarding what was said in the interrogation room. When interrogations are recorded, fewer pre-trial suppression motions are made and fewer claims are made that the police neglected Miranda's dictates. Finally, recording improves relationship between the police and public. By removing secrecy from interrogations, recording should increase public perceptions of the legitimacy of the criminal system more generally. Studies show that taping does not decrease the frequency of confessions, and complaints about cost have not been borne out by departments that have adopted such requirements. In this day and age, recording equipment is inexpensive. Hours of recording time can be saved on an inexpensive digital hard drive, and any minimal costs are offset by the cost benefits of reduced litigation to the entire criminal system. Objections from law enforcement about operator mistakes or equipment failure are resolved in states that have a recording requirement by implementing safety valves or exceptions when recording is not possible or resulted from unintentional error. Finally, Richard proposes several piecemeal reforms to fight against false confessions. These reforms include improving police interrogation training, requiring probable cause to interrogate, prohibiting implicit and explicit threats and promises, banning false evidence ploys, imposing time limits on interrogations, providing additional protections for vulnerable populations such as the mentally handicapped and juveniles, embracing in-court expert testimony on the reliability or unreliability of confessions. It's interesting, isn't it? Professor Leo came forward and spoke at Brendan's appeal hearing in front of Jerome Fox, the one conducted at that time by Steve Drizzen and Laura Nyrider, and Jerome Fox ignored, obviously, what Richard Leo was telling them. And improving jury instructions, requiring probable cause to interrogate, and banning false evidence ploys. That for me is the biggie. Banning them from lying. get rid of this bluffing, as they call it, are perhaps the two most controversial of his suggested reforms. I will discuss these reforms further below. So, Chapter 4, Critiques, Insights and Additional Reforms. Two broad questions were in my mind when I finished reading Professor Leo's book. The first is whether Richard's conclusions about the attitude of detectives towards interrogation and their suspects, how interrogations occur in the real world, and the frequency with which false evidence, ploys, and extreme psychological coercion are used are entirely accurate. The second question is whether the problem of false confessions outweighs potential benefits to our society from modern forms of psychological interrogation. I cannot definitively answer either question. Regarding the first question, excuse me. Regarding the first question, I, like most scholars, am limited by the fact that I have not performed decades of empirical research, as has Richard. To truly test Richard's claims, I would have to review the tapes of the thousands of interrogations he has studied over the past decades, or perform my own research to determine whether his sample set is representative. We all have our beliefs and biases about police interrogation. However, whether stemming from television, scholarship, or real-world experience, I have limited personal experience with interrogations. I participated in several interrogations with federal law enforcement agents as an assistant United States attorney. As I say, Mark Godsey was very, very high up the food chain when it comes to prosecutors, including a 12-hour interrogation in which the suspect ultimately made incriminating statements leading to a prosecution for murder. None of the psychological techniques or false evidence ploys described in Leo's article were used. But I was not present for the vast majority of police interrogations that I have later introduced into evidence in court, and I have no real-world experience, either as a participant or voyeur, outside of that limited realm. My instincts suggest that Leo is more or less on point, however. His empirical research is extensive. He has probably witnessed, either live or on tape, more actual interrogations than many veteran police interrogators in high-crime urban centres. But whether his conclusions are biased, I cannot say. This brings me to the point I made in the introduction of this review. I suspect that Richard's most enthusiastic critics will be law enforcement personnel. Such critics should be deflected with a single point. If law enforcement personnel wish to prove Richard wrong, they must open up the process for further scrutiny and study. Those who hide the ball are on thin ice to complain that others have mischaracterized the situation. I experienced my first resistance to videotaping interrogations in my first weeks as a federal prosecutor in 1995. A suspect and his attorney from another state came in for a proffer session, an interview conducted by an FBI agent and me to determine if he was a suitable candidate for cooperation against other suspects in the same conspiracy. The suspect's attorney asked that the session be videotaped. It seemed like a reasonable request to me. I then asked my supervisor if I could videotape the encounter, but received a strong rebuff. I was informed that such a request was against the policies of the United States Department of Justice. The supervisor explained that the public would not understand the things we have to do. More recently, as director of the Ohio Innocence Project, I have worked to have videotaping legislation passed in Ohio. I have given talks in support of the legislation to prosecution groups, sheriff's associations, and police unions across the state. So far, I mostly have been met with stiff resistance. the chief of police of a major Ohio city, was quoted as saying that the legislation demonstrates, quote, a great distrust of law enforcement. To law enforcement critics of Leo's conclusions about police attitudes and values in the interrogation room, I respond that you do not have a leg to stand on until you allow widespread videotaping so that Richard's assumptions can be empirically put to the test by a variety of scholars across many spectrums. My second question is whether the current risk of false confessions outweighs the benefits to society of intense psychological interrogation. Okay, we all know that maxim that it is, this is a big one, better that 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer. But what if current interrogation methods result in 1,000 convictions of murderers and rapists who would otherwise still roam the streets for each innocent person who falsely confesses? The bottom line is that we simply do not know and cannot know the true costs involved in the various trade-offs between competing interests. It is quite possible that all of Richard's suggested reforms could be implemented with little or no loss of prosecutions of the guilty. But he does not pretend to know. Rather, he identifies the problem of false confessions, which is real, and then prescribes medicine to remedy this problem without any report on the side effects of this medicine. Leo apparently believes that the current state of affairs is simply unacceptable, regardless of the unknown costs his proposed reforms might entail. Where others fall on the spectrum of choices may be a matter of personal policies. I can't help thinking, though, that for the majority of people outside of America, and for a lot of supporters of, trying to help wrongfully convicted people, that this idea that you can have these, what if 1,000 murderers and rapists were allowed free, rather than having one innocent person imprisoned. I don't think we really accept that at all. It's never appropriate. I mean, that's just a random figure that he's pulled out the air. But for us, it's just not appropriate that, in effect, you're saying that the end justifies the means, which was something that I used to say to Robert Herman quite a lot. All you're telling me about this case is that the end justified the means. Anyway, let's carry on. Nevertheless, I wholeheartedly agree with two of Richard's suggested reforms: the need for universal videotaping and the need for judges to vigorously screen out unreliable confessions under Rule 403 for the reasons he stated. Videotaping opens up the process. It professionalizes interrogation practices. Detectives know that judges and jurors will later scrutinize their behavior in the interrogation room. Detectives can still push hard for much needed confessions, but the eyes of outsiders provide a check against egregious practices. Videotaping also provides an objective record for future litigation. It cuts down on litigation by ending false claims of abuse or Miranda failure. Most importantly, it allows the interrogation to be reconstructed after the fact by experts and courts to determine a confession's reliability. And Leo's case for a renewed emphasis on confession reliability as a prerequisite to admission is overwhelming. He selects Evidence Rule 403 as the regulator of unreliable confessions. I have made the case in a California Law Review article that a stringent requirement for confession reliability is inherent in due process. Through a series of doctrinal errors, beginning in Brown versus United States and culminating in Colorado versus Connolly, the court stripped the reliability factor from the due process inquiry, even as DNA testing began to shed light on the serious problems of unreliable and false confessions resulting in wrongful convictions in this country. For both legal and policy reasons, reliability needs to find a home in our confession law jurisprudence. This home could rest both the due process clause and in Rule 403, as Leo suggests. Now, his other reforms, embracing expert witnesses on the reliability issue, improving police interrogation training, and creating new jury instructions to deal with the issue of unreliable confessions, are all needed reforms. Coupled with videotaping and a new thrust towards screening out unreliable confessions on the front end, these reforms together would go a long way toward minimizing the harmful impact of false confessions. In one respect, I would go further than Leo. Leo seems to give up on the ideal of improving Miranda, but I believe that Miranda can be revitalized to some extent to help it achieve its intended function. I made the case in a Minnesota Law Review article that an additional warning should be added. If you choose to remain silent, your silence cannot be used against you. This warning was not part of the original Miranda warnings because the court had not yet ruled in Doyle that post-Miranda silence is post-Miranda silence is inadmissible. The court in Miranda believed that this Doyle warning was implicit. Suspects will naturally understand that silence cannot be used against them. But Leo's own empirical research has shown that suspects do not get this right as the Miranda court believed. Many suspects feel that they have no choice but to talk and thus are compelled to speak simply because of an erroneous belief that silence in the face of damning accusation will equate with guilt in the eyes of the jury. Leo established that Miranda has little effect, in part because detectives de-emphasize it by reciting the warnings quickly in a perfunctory tone and then launching into intense interrogation without giving a suspect the chance to absorb or consider his rights. His description made me suddenly consider a new way to combat this Miranda nullifying effect. Now that we are in the digital age, with universal taping of interrogation within our grasp, I would consider having Miranda warnings recited to suspects in custody by a judge or defense attorney via videotape. Much like the seatbelt video one watches in commercial airplanes, Miranda could be neutrally explained and emphasized in a way that ensures that suspects truly understand their rights and have time to consider them. Suspects could then verify in writing that they have watched the video, understand their rights, and wish to submit to questioning before interrogation commences. Some have suggested having suspects brought before a magistrate for Miranda warnings or interrogation. Leo asserts that this improperly crosses separation of power lines, but a video of a magistrate informing the suspect of his rights would help cure Miranda's ills without infringing on the judiciary's independent role. Leo urges that prohibition of any threats or offers during interrogations. Leo also urges the prohibition of any threats or offers during interrogations. I have a different, although somewhat similar, take on this issue. Although a full recitation of my admittedly complicated theories about penalties and offers are beyond the scope of this review, I have previously set forth an argument that the self-incrimination clause was designed to regulate this matter, to ensure that suspects are not penalized in any way for exercising their right to remain silent. The reforms with which I continue to struggle are Richard's requirement for probable cause to interrogate and his proposed ban on false evidence ploys. Leo argues that detectives should, just like with search warrants, have to go before a magistrate and establish probable cause before they interrogate a suspect. I understand his reasons for setting forth such a requirement. Police interrogate more intensely the more they need a confession. They most need confessions in cases where other evidence of guilt is weak. The requirement of probable cause might reduce the risk of false confession. I also suspect, however, that a large number of serious crimes are solved each year with reliable confessions that would not have been solved with such a probable cause requirement. If this were the only reform available at this time to combat the problem of false confessions, I might consider it. I think the proper balance can be struck, however, by requiring videotaping, a three-pronged reliability inquiry prior to confession admissibility, embracing expert testimony, and improving jury instructions. No, I don't. I still think that you cannot bluff. I don't accept that. If the only evidence of guilt in a given case is the defendant's confession, having the interrogation on videotape so that the proper examination of the confession's reliability can be performed sufficiently attacks the problem without eliminating otherwise reliable confessions and convictions that might be unattainable with such a probable cause requirement. Finally, I do not have enough data to agree at this time with his proposed ban on false evidence ploys. Now, I can't agree with you there, I'm afraid. Leo argues that it is hypocritical for detectives to hold out interrogation as a truth-seeking venture when they intentionally intersperse lies in the interrogation process. Richard, I am fully with you. I am absolutely 100% behind you. It is hypocrisy. And while lying is generally unseemly as a cultural matter, I am not yet convinced that false evidence ploys do not result in a net gain in the pursuit of truth. I imagine, but lack data to back it up, that falsely telling a suspect his fingerprints have been found at the scene often results in a guilty suspect giving up the game and confessing, allowing scores of crimes to be solved. In a recent Ohio Innocence Project case, I was convinced beyond probable cause that an alternate suspect committed the rape for which my client had spent more than a decade in prison. I interviewed the alternate suspect on the street along with a retired detective who volunteers for my organization. The alternate suspect made some strange and semi-incriminating statements but did not confess. I must admit that although I did not lie to him, I was tempted to falsely tell him that our private DNA testing efforts put him at the scene of the crime scene. Why? Because I wanted to see how he would respond. I intuitively believed that he would not confess unless he knew that the game was over. If he did not confess in response to this news, I at least wanted to gauge his reaction. Did he quickly provide an explanation for why his DNA was at the scene, which could later be discounted through investigation? Did his response give the impression that he was expecting to hear such news and had premeditated a story to try to explain it away, or was he genuinely stumped? This would have been supremely helpful information to obtain. Without knowing how many true confessions and incriminating statements are obtained each year through false evidence ploys, I cannot say that their tendency to cause innocent suspects to falsely confess outweighs their potential benefits. And while I agree that a detective lying to a suspect during an interrogation is unseemly, I believe other reform Leo has suggested are sufficient. I suppose we can't have everything all at once. Okay, yeah. Detectives will know that their actions will be caught on tape and viewed by a judge and jury at a later time. Detectives will be held accountable for their actions, and the fact finders will be able to determine whether the suspect's responses merited the detective's approach. The judge, making a reliability determination before admitting the tape into evidence, will be able to see whether the false evidence ploys eventually beat down the suspect and convinced him that he had no choice but to conjure up a false confession, or the judge will see that the false evidence ploy immediately led to strange and incriminating statements from the suspect, such as providing non-public information about the crime. Experts will be able to view such tapes as well and offer their opinions as to whether the false evidence ploys had a detrimental effect on the truth-seeking purpose of the interrogation. Conclusion. Richard's body of work, summarized in Police Interrogation and American Justice, shines the bright light on police interrogation in America today. He depicts the values and structures of interrogation in a way that few outside of the actual subjects victims of interrogation fully understand. Although I do not agree with all of his conclusions and proposed reforms, his work convincingly raises a point that we must heed if we are to ensure the integrity and fairness of confessions in this country. We must adopt universal videotaping requirements across all jurisdictions and develop new reliability tests to screen out false confessions. Wow. Well, that was really interesting to read that. And hi, Millbilly. If you're ready for your bed, then hopefully that's helped put you to sleep. So, hi, Jazz, Millbilly, Linda. Hi, Disco Pervert. Yes, it is. That is a. Just that one thing alone would be great, wouldn't it? To have that additional thing that says, if you choose to remain silent, this cannot be used against you. And to have it presented as a video where, somebody actually presents this this before you get your interrogation. Yeah, it's an excellent idea which should be looked at. And certainly, oh, hi, Sean, and what else have we got here? Oh, wow, we've even got the Hod here. He's busy chasing sharks, and there he's relaxing, so that's good. Okay, well, thanks very much. I might, if I find time later today, look at an article that I came across. Very interesting case, and so hopefully I'll be able to share a newspaper article with you later on today. Okay, catch you all again soon. Thank you very much. Bye for now.